in our series of Northern Road Link live streaming sessions. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'll be your host for this and other streaming sessions to be done over the next few weeks, focusing on the feedback we've received on the Environmental Assessment Terms of Reference, or TOR. As you may know, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, also known as MECP, has extended the comment period on the Terms of Reference, or TOR, for an additional 90 days until December 14th, 2022, for 22 Indigenous communities that may be affected and or interested in the NRL project. Today, we're going to have a discussion on the climate change and water-related TOR comments we've received. And in the following weeks running up to the closing of the comment period, we'll dive a little bit more deeply into each of the 5 categories to help our audience understand what comments we have received about the TOR document. And again, the purpose of these is it's a high level discussion explaining the kinds of comments we've received, and just sharing what people have been saying with regard to different topics, and hopefully clarifying a few things, and being transparent about these topics as well. So why don't we get started here, and let's start with the climate change and water change comments, and just I want to provide a bit of a commentary on this. Community members hold both of these topics, up very highly. They're at the top of their minds. My experience visiting communities is water is always, for a very good reason, at the top of community members' minds, and more over the last few years, of course, for obvious reasons, come at the top of their minds as well, and because community members are living and seeing changes firsthand, and how they've been affecting their communities. And we're going to get into a discussion of that a little bit later on. Um, and now climate change impacts are magnified that much more in remote communities, such as the 2 communities that are proponents for the Northern Road Link project, Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. These remote communities, road access is only available for a narrow window of time um, on these winter roads. And community members talk a lot about how narrow and how inconsistent that window of time where the road is open has become. And it's creating many problems. It has been for a number of years now for communities, because that's how they get the bulk of their goods, and the cheapest way they get their goods transported, and building materials transported into communities. So climate change is real to community members, not just because of the winter road season, but because community members rely on the land for a good portion of their food. Um, Hunters and fishers pay close attention to weather patterns and the movement of animals at different times of year, and they tell us that these patterns are changing much faster than they did before. And again, I'm going to get into this a little bit later on, but that's why it's so important for community members to share these stories so that we can get that local understanding of climate change impact. So let's have a look at one of the comments that we've received on the TOR, and this one, and I'll just read it as is, and it says the TOR states that, quote, all roadside ditches will be sized for the 10-year minor system design flow and a minimum 100-year major system design flow, in accordance with MTO drainage standards. It is unclear if or how these drainage standards take into account future conditions under climate change. So it's a very good comment, and I just want to say that the climate change is, from a design perspective, is probably the biggest consideration, because it's so prominent now, and you know, not taking into consideration climate change will result in some real problems on projects. And I'll go into maybe some we'll look at a few photos a little bit later on about some of these. And so comments regarding whether the specifications of different road elements such as roadside ditches, or like whether it's the depth or capacity of these ditches, culverts, the capacity of culverts to handle the flows generated from different storm events, and bridges, for example, the height of bridges with higher water levels. Um, you know, they have to take into account climate change, all the design of all these different infrastructure components. They have to, because if they don't, then there will be issues um, as we move along with time, because these events are getting more extreme and they're getting more frequent. Uh, you know, so for example, you know, if you look at spring and winter, um, look at like ice breakup, for example. You've got the ice breaking up on the rivers, and you know, with higher water levels, and you know, the ice breakup events may be more frequent or more significant, causing flooding upstream, which could then overtop onto, you know, and flood communities as well. So there's a lot of potential really negative impacts of climate change. And what also could be affected is the amount of pr- protection, I guess, around culvert pipes, because many of you probably noticed when a culvert pipe goes underneath a road, at the outlets on either side, or the inlet and the outlet, typically there's a picture right there. Typically there's armoring or large stones around these inlets and outlets, and if that, you know, if those uh, inlets and outlets aren't protected properly, they can, you know, that stone can be washed away, and then the culvert is threatened, and then you get a situation like what you're seeing on the screen right now. Um, so translating that into the project itself, what you may end up with is a lot more rock being required to protect these culverts, larger stone, more of the stone to protect these culverts, to make sure that they're not washed away under heavy flows. Um, so let's take a look at maybe some of the other photos too associated with climate change, if we can move on to the next one. So here's overtopping of a gravel road here, and so what you've got is whether it's, I'm not sure whether it's probably a wetland on either side of the road, and there was a flooding event, and so the water's overtopped the road, so you can get washouts of the road. So then you're getting into, you know, if you want to adapt this for climate change, you know, you may be looking at raising the road elevation to prevent situations from this happening. If you're anticipating water levels rising higher than before, um, creating water storage features, such as ditches along the side of the road, and making those ditches higher capacity than ever before as well. So there's another scenario that could be faced where you get the road overtopping. If we can look at another image here. There we go. So here's two culverts that have been exposed from a washout here, overtopping. So all these kinds of situations present themselves here, and so you really have to anticipate this. So our engineers who focus on surface water um, use different modeling tools, and they use these modeling tools and look at flows in the area, and they look at various scenarios, and scenarios are different possible situations. And when they look at these, they're able to come up with an idea of what size of culvert pipe to use, and or in the case of bridges, you know, what what type of bridge, what size of bridge, the height of the bridge above water levels. Again, because if water levels are rising, um, you would have to raise the bridge up as well too to compensate for that as well too. So if we can show another image up on the screen, I think we've got another. Oh, okay. Let's go back to that previous one there. Yeah, so there's a lot of different elements of the road that have to be considered in the design phase, whether it's ditches, whether it's culverts, whether it's bridges, um, that all have to be considered very thoughtfully. And yes, the MTO has been adapting uh, their guidelines or sorry, their standards for the construction of roads with climate change, and obviously for good reason, because if you don't build these to have them get washed out, to have these roads get washed out, this infrastructure is expensive to purchase and install. So it's really important that what they put in place is able to withstand whatever climate change throws at us. So that's one big element of climate change. It certainly affects the road design side of things. Now let's talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions, because we've received another comment. This comment was: will estimates be provided of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions with reasonably foreseeable future activities that the project may facilitate by providing infrastructure? So this is all part of the cumulative effects aspect of the environmental assessment work that we're doing, where we have to look at any previous existing and reasonably foreseeable future projects. So we try to look at these by discipline and predict what the scenario might look like. So in this case, we might be looking at, a road in place with mines in the Ring of Fire, depending on which ones I'm not sure, but it just depends on what's considered reasonably foreseeable, and then looking at what the greenhouse gas emissions would be from under those different scenarios or situations. So there's a lot of there's a lot of thought put into that. Again, a lot of the work is predictive. It's using models, and there are a lot of assumptions involved in it. But the idea is that the assumptions are careful enough and thoughtful enough to try to try to be realistic, actually. So, when it comes to greenhouse gases, those are some of the thoughts around that. Now, let's talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge, because Indigenous knowledge and climate change are two things that should be very closely connected. Um, Now, a couple of comments we've received, let me read them to you. The first one was: the TOR must be updated to clarify that the climate change assessment will consider and incorporate Indigenous knowledge, as well as Indigenous perspectives and experiences, to ensure a holistic view is taken and applied. And then another comment is: climate change assessment must also consider Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous knowledge to ensure a holistic view is taken and applied. So let's dive into this a little bit here. Having spent quite a bit of time in remote First Nation communities, talking to community members, as I mentioned, climate change issues are talked about a lot. And particularly the elders who have spent, in many cases, their entire life on the land and the waters of their homeland, they provide the best source of information regarding climate change, local information about climate change. Whether you're talking about areas flooding that didn't flood previously, or and this one is probably more common, changes in what I call the spatial distribution and abundance of wildlife. So where wildlife is, different species of wildlife is at different times of year. because there have been significant changes. These changes have happened more rapidly than they did in the past because there's always change. Um, so there's a lot of information that you can collect from community members when it comes to climate change. And, community members have that incredible collective knowledge of their environment, because their survival, as hunters and fishers, depends on paying attention to what's going on in the environment, and interpreting change and adapting to change. Um, and as I mentioned, this community-based information, this Indigenous knowledge information, that's collectively held by the community members, really offers some really valuable insights, um, that local insights at a very high level of detail that complement the scientific data that's collected as part of an environmental assessment. And this information is very time based, and as I mentioned, it's very detailed, in terms of uh, locations. So, uh, you know, if you were to sit down with community members, you could collect a lot of information on things that they've observed and where they've observed them over time, like changes in where and geese migrate, in their homelands, or where caribou are typically found. Like all these things, they need to be added together and combined with the scientific knowledge, that Western science knowledge, to be able to paint a really good picture as to what's happening, in impact wise from climate change. So, that Indigenous knowledge, it provides that really sort of crucial foundation for how communities can adapt and control impacts of climate change. So it sort of finds, well, sort of is the foundation basically of that climate change, of factoring in climate change to the environmental assessment work. So, we're going to continue to keep talking to community members to try and pick up, collect that information from them as to what's been going on in their community, in their homeland over time, so we can start to really piece together and figure out ways of making sure that projects such as this one don't have significant impacts. And I think it's important to remember for non-Indigenous people that, um, Indigenous people have a different perspective of nature. They see it as all these natural elements are part of their family, and they're living conscious beings, and they're inseparable from humanity. So, these are important things to keep in mind, and I can give you an example, that I was able to dig up. And um, if you look at these increasingly frequent, and severe wildfires in California that have been making headlines over the last few summers, and um, you know, yes, climate change is a big part of that, but it's also the result of poor forest management. And to give you an example, the state of California had basically banned, an effective forest management practice, which is prescribed burns, intentional burn areas. And these were techniques that were developed by the indigenous people of the area, and without these controlled burns, that have Native Americans have been prescribing and actively conducting in forests for centuries. The problem is the forests grow really thick with vegetation, and then they dry out, and then you've got all this vegetation, dry vegetation in the forest that serves as kindling for the wildfires, and then they just grow out of control. So, there has been a change in California over the last few years, where they've sort of changed their ways a bit, and they've been working with native tribes to start bringing back these prescribed burns, because they've learned that, by doing this, it clears the forest floor, and it just prevents that kindling, that food for the fire from building up. So there's a lot there. There's a lot of wisdom in taking Indigenous knowledge and factoring that into climate change as well. So, oh, look, there's an impressive forest fire there, isn't it? Wow, that's a good one. So let's now talk a little bit about downstream and down muskeg effects. So this is a really hot topic, I would say. The Northern Road Link will be traveling as it's planned now. We'll be traveling through a section that is part of the James Bay lowlands, and this presents challenges building through the muskeg. These challenges are both engineering and construction related and environmental, and these must be considered in all stages of the project, whether it's design, construction, or operation. Now, in the design and construction phases, what this involves is limiting how much disturbance is made to the peat, and in ensuring that the passage below of water beneath the road is relatively unimpeded, so it's not blocked to any large extent, because you want the water levels on either side of the road through the muskeg to be essentially equal. It's important that that flow be allowed to continue, and the EA and IA process involves it's important to remember that the EAIA process involves the development of commitments, including environmental monitoring programs. And these are developed during the course of the environmental assessment or impact assessment. And as we learn more about the project, we learn better how to mitigate um, impacts that we can foresee, that we might see coming. So even at the beginning of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment, we have an idea of what kind of potential impacts the road might have. And there are accepted ways, standard ways of mitigating or limiting those impacts. But what happens is, as the environmental assessment or the impact assessment proceeds over time, we get sort of a refinement. So we get, with all that information that's being collected as part of the baseline environmental work, we're getting a better idea of different areas and how to treat different areas, and where the problems might be, those impacts might be greater, what areas they might be greater in compared to other areas. So what happens is you get this refinement of of um, of of impacts and of mitigation. And then as time goes on, commitments are identified as part of the project, and then monitoring programs get developed as part of the project as well too. So typically, when the environmental assessment is submitted for review by the regulators, what happens then is you get a review, and then if the project is approved, it's approved typically with conditions, and that those would involve meeting commitments, and quite typically subsequent monitoring, whether it's locally on the along the road itself, for example, or even regionally, where they want to have a better understanding of maybe regional impacts, and be able to sort of identify when maybe some things might some things might be going wrong, where what was intended is not happening, and then there's an opportunity to intervene and address problems as they come up, so that those commitments and the subsequent monitoring help identify situations where that might occur, and allow those problems to be addressed. So there's a lot involved in that, but again, it's important to remember that as time goes on, those commitments and those monitoring programs get refined to the point that they're quite detailed, and they're quite prescriptive about specific areas and how they're to be treated. So that baseline information and the collection of that baseline information feeds into the refinement of identifying potential impacts. So we did receive a few comments as well on groundwater, and then the comments on groundwater, I'll read it to you here. One of the comments is the TOR does not specify that the environmental assessment report or environmental impact statement will describe interactions between groundwater and surface water. This information is required to understand the project full pathway of effects on groundwater, surface water, and linked valued components. So, you know, we are doing baseline studies on groundwater for this project, and we will be drilling a number of wells for this project with the purpose of being able to get a better understanding of groundwater quality, so we can take samples from those wells to look at the baseline conditions in different areas of the groundwater. And then we also look at we install piezometers which measure the groundwater depth to groundwater, and so we can track changes, seasonal changes in groundwater levels using these piezometers that are installed at the well locations. So um, that's those are some of the activities that we're in, we're involved with in terms of groundwater. And then when it comes to surface water, the terms of reference doesn't specify uh, that the one of the comments is the terms of reference does not specify that the environmental assessment report or environmental impact statement will describe seasonal changes in water quantity. This information is required to understand any seasonal variation in potential project effects on surface water quantity. So we are doing a number of different activities with regard to surface water, quantity samples, our quality samples at various locations, particularly at the crossing locations where we're spending a lot of time doing fish community work as well too. So surface water is a pretty major consideration as part of the work that we're doing. Um, so that is a very fast, admittedly, review of some of the climate change comments that we've received and water-related comments that we've received. So I hope that was helpful to everyone. I just wanted to remind Indigenous communities and the general public that they can engage with the project team in a number of different ways, whatever best suits them. Uh, I want to get this point across. It's really important because, we're putting out basically a menu of engagement options for your community to engage with us, and they might take different forms. They could be focus group sessions, they could be community sessions, they could be drop-in sessions, virtual focus groups, virtual community presentations, teleconferences, local radio call-in shows. We can visit your community and be on your local radio station, and then online surveys too. So we've got a lot of different ways that we're offering to engage with your community. You can also visit our website at northernroadlink.ca, email us at info@northernroadlink.com, call us at 188-515-3607. Lots of different options. We want we want to be as transparent as possible on this project with you. And we are going to see you again in 2 weeks. And our topic 2 weeks from now will be EA process and EA higher level comments. And this may be a two-part session because we've got a lot of comments that are related to the EA process and about EAs in general and higher sort of high, like I call them, higher level, less specific comments about environmental assessment. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. There's going to be a lot to talk about on that one. So with that, we will see you again in two weeks. Miigwech, and see you soon. Take care.